Morning. Good morning.
Hello, Paul. Those shrimps sound interesting.
Yeah, it's a little bit scary, but we'll get to that. Incredible photos on social media. We'll send you one later.
I'll have to have a look.
Yes. Look, to the issue of cashless welfare, we expect that there might be some kind of legislation passed through Parliament. Well, that's the question. Where is Labor standing on the idea of this being expanded?
Labor's position is very clear, and as you've indicated in your introduction, the cashless debit card is existing in 4 trial sites, or so-called trial sites at the moment. The trials in some areas seem to be going on for a very long time, and one of those sites is around Ceduna there in your state. And Labor's position is as follows, that we do not support a national rollout of the card, and the Minister, Anne Ruston, has indicated that that's a conversation that needs to be had. We don't believe there's been any real research, or there has not been any evaluation done to say whether or not this is successful, and that is quarantining income without consultation and discussion. It hasn't worked anywhere else in the world. If it's voluntary, it's a different matter. And the other thing, of course, is that there is supposed to be wraparound services provided in those trial sites, and that has certainly not been the case. And Labor is not convinced that there should be any further rollout of this card.
Certainly, yeah, when it comes to opponents of the scheme, that's been the commentary, that they're not seeing the evidence that this is improving the lives of the people that it's meant to be helping. I suppose, does that mean is there a conversation to be had with the government, or is it just really a straight no at this point?
Labor's position is we're not supporting any legislation that arbitrarily rolls this card out, and it is just remarkable. I mean, there are 23,000 people in the Northern Territory that are currently on centrelink payments, and without any proper consultation or discussion or explanation, these 23,000 people are going to be switched from the basics card, which came in during the intervention 12 years ago, to the cashless debit card. Now, I just think there are issues of people's rights. There is a responsibility on government to gain informed consent, and that certainly has not happened. And in the instance of the Northern Territory, 23,000 people without consent. It's almost social engineering, really.
You alluded to the idea of if it was voluntary. How would a voluntary cashless welfare card scheme work?
Well, it already exists in some parts of Australia. For example, in the Canterbury Bankstown area, which is an area that I'm very familiar with, there is a voluntary scheme of sorts, and that is people self-identify if they need help with managing their income. There are instances where Labor believes people should be moved onto this form of payment, but case managed, and that's in cases where there's persistent child protection issues or domestic violence issues. But that's very different to what the government is proposing, and that is an automatic change or an automatic application to people that are on a social security payment. And we just don't believe that that's appropriate. There are so many instances, Paul, and I've spoken to people who are competent people doing their best, raising their children, often single mums, who feel that they're being re-traumatised by not having say over the way in which they use their money. There are many places in Australia where a cash economy exists, and people who are on that card are absolutely disadvantaged in that situation.
I mean, the amount that comes through on your cashless welfare card is still the same amount. It just means you can't spend, like 80% of it on drinking, on alcohol, on gambling service, etc. Why is that particularly a bad thing?
Well, that's the theory, but it just doesn't work that way. I mean, in all of the sites where the trial is being pursued, that's the East Kimberley, Ceduna, the Goldfields in WA, and up around the Hinkler or the Hervey Bay area in Queensland, black economies have emerged, and that disadvantages people that are on the card. For example, if you are desperate for some cash to pay your kid's school uniform or whatever, you either go to a payday lender, which is a disaster, or you might go and use your card to do, for example, I don't know, $120 worth of grocery shopping and come out and sell those groceries for $70. That is the reality of what's going on. Roadside stores for fruit and vegetables up in the Hinkler, the Queensland area, were a trust and a common thing. They no longer exist. People can't use their card for buying things on the internet, which is much cheaper. If a PNC is running a school uniform, second-hand school uniform shop, it's all cash, and people just can't access those things if they are on this card.
I'm not sure if you've seen the story today from Guardian Australia, but the Australian National University researcher Elise Klein put in a Freedom of Information request. The headline, effectively, is that in Western Australia, in Wyndham and Kununurra, it says the cashless debit card has failed to reduce family violence in one of the first trial sites and may have actually coincided with an increase in abuse. So what's your reaction to that headline?
Paul, I actually haven't seen the report, so I'd rather read it before making comment. But I have heard that scenario, and I've actually visited that particular site as well. We're very much waiting for Adelaide University to produce an evaluation, which is going to be very important. But the point that I'm making is I am not arguing, and Labor is not arguing against, this approach, providing it's voluntary or in situations where it is going to make a difference. For example, when I went to the Hervey Bay, Bundaberg area just recently, this card is supposed to reduce gambling, and the revenue from poker machines has gone up exponentially. Now, I don't know what that means, except it doesn't sound right to me.
My guest is Linda Burney, the Shadow Minister for Indigenous Australians and the Shadow Minister for Families and Social Services. Look, I think it would be quite appropriate given what we had last week, which was the Closing the Gap report, and we've been talking about that a whole lot here. Obviously, very much disappointing results. I think that's pretty fair to say, given only 2 of the 7 measures are on track. What was your reaction to the lack of progress there?
Well, my response is pretty much summed up in the way in which you've introduced this particular issue. The point that I've made is of the 7 targets, as you've indicated, Paul, the only 2 that are on track are the early childhood education target of 4-year-olds being enrolled in preschool and the Year 12 attainment. I think the one that I find the most shocking, or the 2 that I find the most shocking, is child mortality and life expectancy. In some areas have not improved or in fact gone backwards. But the real issue for people to think about is that in the Aboriginal community, these are not statistics. These are aunties, uncles, sons, daughters, mothers, fathers, grandparents. And I've been in your area. I've been to Scodesco and Cabina, where children can't access the internet or do their homework. Scodesco was running out of water. Now, the reality of what's going on the ground has to be understood through what is a ritual in the Parliament every 12 months. My understanding, and I've got enormous faith in the Coalition of Peaks working with the government on a new set of targets, and my understanding is that they will be more comprehensive and that there will be a better partnership between First Nations people and the government. Those two things are incredibly important.
Yeah, in fact, in the conversations we've had in the last week, and particularly talking to a lot of Indigenous stakeholders, really the main theme and the main point that's come out of it is that the decision making really needs to be put with the Indigenous community rather than a top-down approach. Is that going to happen?
That is absolutely right, the way that you've described it. And my understanding is that the partnership arrangement between the Coalition of Peak Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations and the COAG process, which sounds terribly complex, but it's not. It's the peak organisations working with government to set a new arrangement in how business is done, but also new targets is what's on the agenda, and hopefully we'll see that materialise before the end of the year.
All right. Linda Burney, you've been very generous with your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.